any kind of neat resonances with our earlier discussion about visibility, invisibility, that the relationship between some kind of modern forest, the local. So, is there any questions about issues about data, for example? Yes, sure.
Thank you, Justin. My question is for Nick. I'm curious about these emergence at the beginning of your period, this local discourse, the claim to local sovereignty. And do you have an idea who were the agents producing this discourse, and where was there any pre-revolutionary, pre-constitutional written tradition that they were drawing on? Were they drawing on stuff from the capital, from abroad?
Sure. So there's a wide debate about the role of the Enlightenment in all of this. I start my project in 1766 because essentially that's where there is a top-down reform of what happens at a local level, and that essentially fails. Not surprisingly, the Inquisition steps in and sort of stalls that. So some of these ideas are in circulation about the role of local government with vis-a-vis the central government. It's really in the vacuum of power that's posed by the French invasion, where they topple the monarchy, they take the king to France, and the population is left with the question of what do we do? There is a transition here also in the notion of who is sovereign. The jurist from Salamanca talked about los pueblos, the towns, being sovereign, and there's a transition there around that time to el pueblo, singular, the people. And so it's really in this vacuum of power where there isn't that authority above, where a lot of these ideas are negotiated at the local level and sort of filter back up through the constitutional regimes.
So it would be interesting just for Comparanda to look at other local administrations and to see if the language is similar. Or...
Yeah, and I think, given your background in Mediterranean studies, I think actually there's a lot of similarities with what we see elsewhere in the Mediterranean. Certainly in Italy, the notion of campedonismo, the local community being most key, it has very close parallels with what we see in Spain. But there's no one that's really looked at this yet in the Italian case.
Susan?
This is a question for Jeff, and I'm really interested in the history of violence. So you sort of framed that as an opening question, and it kind of disappeared. I mean, there's the history of the community, which is, to some extent, includes a certain amount of violence in the construction of particular neighborhoods. But I wondered, and because you featured these two murders as part of this, what different forms, how over 150 years are there different forms of violence used by different people, different meanings given to them? I mean, to what extent can we historicize? I mean, because obviously these murders are part of a particular moment in the history of violence and in the history of the community. So.
And so actually, this is my first foray into history, actually. And so as an anthropologist who's done a lot of work doing participant observation. And so what I'm trying to do is make certain similarities within that continuum and establish to a certain degree that the types of violence that were occurring, you see, because what didn't really emerge here was the relationship to the forms of racialized violence, and what I'm really getting at. And that's what I sort of ended up rushing through. And that's actually the essence of what my dissertation is about, and how the different iterations of racialized violence has gone from 150 years ago when former slaves, and I actually go back to sort of what they were experiencing in those times. When I had the picture of C.L. Dellums, the point was the type of violence that he experienced during Jim Crow years in the 1920s, and that he was fleeing. And so it really is within the context of race and violence, and that is the connection.
Because I think it would be really interesting for you to think about. We take violence as a category, as kind of something that we know what it means,
right?
And what it means.
And so I do extrapolate, actually, and that's why I use these as some different forms of structural violence, which comes from the anthropologist Paul Farmer. There's symbolic violence, which comes from Pierre Bourdieu, and I'm dealing with sort of everyday violence, the peacetime crimes that Nancy Shepherd Hughes talks about. And so I am trying to locate within certain periods also, where that violence, the prominence of that violence sort of occurs, and also how they interact and they intermingle and they cross over each other, and that's the continuum that I'm getting at, and how it relates to physical violence, as well as the idea of the event in particular. And these events, something like the earthquake, that did create, sort of this very different moment, where these other forms of violence then took these other iterations, for example, and that was in the death of Danny. And it was from the earthquake, the resistance movements of the past actually had some success. And what they did was they forced the city to not rebuild that. And that actually led to the sort of the gentrification which is now occurring in my neighborhood. Because they were able to connect this little space to the other neighborhoods. And also that coincides with the moment of the housing boom, the dot-com boom, and it was seen as part of that sort of movement. And so in that process, those are these ways that I'm trying to sort of extrapolate these different ideas and different definitions of violence, even within those specific moments.
Right.
First of all, I wanted to congratulate everybody for coping with this presentation format. Excellent job. It was the idea of your moderator. I've seen him give a talk like this before.
No, it wasn't my idea. I don't take any credit or blame for that.
I have to confess, it's actually really hard for me to talk about this because I've experienced it personally.
Yeah.
And to do it in such a format, it just broke down. Or I broke down. It didn't happen when I was rehearsing all 3,000 times.
Yeah.
And so,
excellent. I have a question for each panelist. I want to just continue with this earlier question, because it seems to me the way you set it up with these two, seemingly senseless murders that occur in your neighborhood, and the way what I understood from you is that you were trying to make sense of it by providing some sort of historical narrative.
Absolutely.
But basically, this is a sort of therapeutic intervention. This is what the therapists do. That you have this event that doesn't make sense, and you try to put it into a narrative that seems to make it legible and comprehensible.
I have a whole chapter.
Let me just finish. And I think there's nothing wrong with it. It just means that you necessarily create a peculiar kind of historical narrative that brings in continuity, and you may lose sight of ruptures and change and discontinuity.
Actually, just to piggyback on that, I noticed that you're in medical anthropology, so I just kind of wanted to hear how this fits into.
First of all, I think that's a really interesting point, and that's why I originally used it as a topic. Was to sort of engage as catharsis, as a cathartic process. And I actually have a chapter on the failure of catharsis, because what it was iatrogenic actually, and it still is, and that's when I talked about the difficulty of doing it. I actually finally just moved out of the neighborhood about a month ago, and for reasons of violence that my children witnessed. And it's only been recent that I've actually been able to reflect upon it and gain that distance in that process. And so in retrospect, I wouldn't have done it again. And it was actually absolutely that search. And I wonder, and it's been for the last, actually it's been 2 months that it's only been like the last few weeks that I've had, like I just said, that distance to really reflect on it and think of it in terms of an analysis. And I had, prior to this, I did a book on homeless heroin addicts that I spent a long time doing, and I'm a photographer. And I reflected a lot about, because you saw 2 different images that I took. The first one of Antoine was in black and white, and the second one of Danny, which was in color. And I talk about sort of that relationship of what I talk about as being a gesture of artifice, and how one allowed me to engage in a certain type of analysis that the other one didn't allow me to engage in. One meaning that I was much more separated from Antoine's life and his experiences, as opposed to Danny's experiences. And this is difficult to talk about because I don't want to. Anyway, the point being is that because of the certain experience that I had with Danny, the way that I was trying to move the pictures into my style, which I'm sort of that I've established, was impossible. And so I have also in that relationship to doing this type of anthropology and this type of work, I have absolutely recognized what could be missing, and within that space in which I was engaging, what could sort of be would just be, you know, reiterate, missing from my analysis. But that doesn't, you know, say that what I do have in of itself doesn't, you know, emerge as something to me very interesting, you know, within that process. And going back to the medical anthropology part, is because, you know, I work in the field of, I deal with issues of violence, deal with issues of the body, deal with issues of suffering in a certain way. And, you know, and that's sort of what pushed me towards it. My original intention prior to Danny actually getting killed was to look at sort of what Nancy Shepherd Hughes calls the invisible genocide in a community like that in particular. And what didn't come out of this is how it really brings up sort of the experience of African Americans, how they continue to be, you know, to be killed, or kill each other in this process, and how that process goes through with inordinate amount of numbers. The killing of Danny was the anomaly. You know, that's literally one in 140 or 114 at this moment, or something like that. You know, some crazy number for that year. I don't remember exactly the statistic for 2009. But I think your point is, you know, is super well taken. Absolutely.
So can I just rip off of Frank's, you know, question, comment, and what I've been thinking about here as this discussion has sort of moved forward is the notion of, you know, catharsis on the one hand, which, you know, you are clearly engaging in, or it motivated your work on the one hand, and, you know, at the opposite end, the notion of, you know, ourselves, our intellectual work as, you know, objective, analytically distant. You know, we are engaging in a process of, you know, deconstruction, or whatever, you know, term we want to call that. And I'm wondering, you know, what I've noticed is, you know, even as we're engaging in, you know, this work of scholarship that is outside of ourselves, so often I think people on some level choose research projects that engage with something that really is about ourselves. And you have to. Well, of course. But I mean, but so you know, I mean, you've given us, you know, a very clear example of where your project came from, and I wonder, could we hear from the other two about, you know, sort of where these projects came for you? What is your emotional, political, intellectual, personal investment in the research that you're working on?
For me, I'm just fascinated by oil, but also when I was an undergrad, I was in an Afro-Costa Rican community that actually said no to oil, and they actually fought against the Costa Rican government against Harkin, which is Bush's and Cheney's oil company. And later on, I switched to looking at Ecuador, and it just kind of developed out of the things that happen in the field, trying to pick a site and a topic.
And why did you become a cultural anthropologist? Like, how did that methodology, that particular way of looking at the world, sort of speak to you?
Because I want to do it through how people see the world and how they're actively like trying to recreate or, you know, create something.
Yeah, I've always had an interest in history. I actually started graduate school with a focus on Basque nationalism, and I was very interested in the questions of, you know, why would someone fight and die for this idea of the nation? And what the direction that this project has gone is essentially challenging that notion of a narrative of Spain being a nation, and saying actually it's a lot of little nations. That whole notion of that one unified Spain doesn't really even exist unto the present. You can open the newspapers today and see Catalans talking about separatists and Basques trying to break apart from the country as well. So, you know, what are the historical origins of how we see all this, I guess?
Michelle?
Yeah, I just have a sort of going off of this sort of very, very interesting contrast in the methodologies for Jeffrey's sort of first person's my neighborhood, and both of you are speaking in a much more sort of historical, sort of scholarly kind of way. I'm just wondering about Jeffrey, what's the advantage other than of putting it in terms of my neighborhood, my experience? Would you think of redoing it in the third person narrative? Would that be less true, or? So I'm wondering about the advantage that you see of using the first person narrative.
Part of the advantage is almost like a political credibility. You know, in a way that, well, you know, it's funny because I was sort of making a statement that, you know, I felt that there was an importance to be engaged in worlds that we were engaged in, especially if I'm going to do work on suffering. and the suffering is literally, around me in such a way, my next door neighbors. In that way, I felt ethically that was something that I wanted to engage in. And so I think it's also, there's something about, maybe it is in and of itself just a narrative trope. But my work does engage, but it's important to recognize that my work does engage my experience. And that experience of my wife and the experiences of my children. And, and for me, I guess, at this point, I don't know if I think that's a good question. I haven't thought about it. It's engaged. It's because I'm still maybe stuck in that moment of, when we talked about the catharsis and talk about it being sort of traumatic and being in that process, that it still feels, it's that experience that I am trying to somehow reconcile. It is very much my experience that I'm trying to reconcile. And so I'm not sure, maybe in the future I will be in a space to sort of see it or think about it differently in that third person. But I think that's a really interesting way to think about it.
That's a question of being more academic.
I know, but that's also maybe part of my inclination too. I come from community organizing and doing that type of work, and so that's really where I want my work to be situated as a public anthropologist. Sort of the field that I see, trying to get these works out into the public and dealing with progressive social justice issues. I'm finding that to personalize it might be a way to connect other people outside of it.
Okay, so it looks like we're going to be back on time. But I want to end this with a question that I thought ties into the other one, because all of you deal with this relationship between some kind of modern structure and its attempt to make the visible invisible. And what I see you doing is trying to make the invisible legible. So I guess my question then, that I'll leave hanging, will be, in what ways can we as scholars engage in various kinds, because you're all doing something, as Jennifer points out, as some kind of personal effort to make a statement of some sort. So how can we as scholars then engage, because I think this is one of the central issues that we're engaged with in humanities at UCSD, is some kind of public purpose that goes beyond writing good scholarship. And so how can we engage in various ways about making the invisible legible, and therefore acting in a way that gives voice and other things more kind of presence. So thank you very much. And thank you for